Even if you haven't seen Ghost in the Shell, its several remakes, television series, and original manga, you probably have at least heard of the franchise. If you haven't heard of Ghost in the Shell, the quick way to sum it up is that it's basically just the most influential cyberpunk anime ever made. And no, that's not really a major assumption or generalization, it really is that. It also happens to be one of the few anime a young person in 1995 might actually get their parents to sit down and watch. Set in a dystopian future where humanity can upload its consciousness into shells, it explores a slew of questions about the dangers and downfalls of such an existence, and ultimately raises the question of, is anybody in this movie actually human anymore? Despite the 1995 movie bombing in Japan, it influenced the young minds of many prominent creators worldwide. Nary a science fiction movie is released without a writer or director citing it as an influence. Major franchises such as The Matrix, Deus Ex, and Cyberpunk would be birthed quite clearly from Ghost in the Shell's ideas, and go on to explore further or give their own takes on its themes. Even Avatar, James Cameron's bombastic epic about the struggle between a native alien race and resource-hungry humans, would name-drop Ghost in the Shell as its influence, referring to the technology which allows humans to transfer their consciousness into alien bodies. Now, despite its powerful influence, one that seems to permeate countless big-name creative outings, Ghost in the Shell can be complicated to watch in 2023. It's a film that demands the entirety of a viewer's attention. Nearly every line and moment has some significance in the story at hand. It's entirely possible that if someone were to miss even a little seemingly throwaway comment made by one of its characters, they may not understand certain events or the deeper manipulations of its behind-the-scene antagonist, the Puppet Master. It could also be the most extreme example of show don't tell I've ever encountered in an animated film. Viewers are dropped into a world of functions and terms that are never directly explained. Its characters are defined by how they handle the situations and interact with the world. They've all lived here so long that the advancements of technology of this new world are now mundane, and therefore there's no wonder to be had. Transferring consciousness has become something so common as owning a television, and all the while, a soundtrack that I can only describe as nihilistic occasionally reminds you that Ghost in the Shell is one big existential crisis. What does this have to do with the PlayStation game? Not a lot, honestly, but that's also why I bring it up, so bear with me. You've likely seen this game floating around on a lot of top 10 lists. Famously considered one of the best anime game adaptations ever made, or so it's considered by a few outlets. Yes, that's a big stretch. I'm a massive fan of the original film, and I've watched it even more as I've inched towards my mid-30s. It's probably one of the most adult stories I've ever encountered, as it tackles those extremely complicated questions that tend to pop up as a person gets older, and ultimately gives no concrete answer, because there is no answer to meaning or purpose. However, Ghost in the Shell's PlayStation game tackles nothing like this, and is instead just a story about a rookie piloting a miniature version of the movie Spider Tank. Don't get me wrong, the Spider Tank scene in the film is incredible, but this is a shallow takeaway. None of the film's themes or concepts are really ever explored here. Instead, we get a throwaway story that plays second fiddle to the gameplay. There are no highs or lows regarding what is happening. It feels like some side case in Section 9's history. And yes, I'm fully aware that the original manga's creator wrote it, but unless there was some subtle intention not to overshadow the manga or movie, I really don't get why it ended up this way. Doubtlessly, one of the most exciting aspects of the original film was its tendency to move away from the anime tropes and provide a serious narrative. The game, it has cute tanks, which I'm aware had been in a few volumes of the manga to some extent, but why are they made cute and why do they sound like children?
But Tom, look, see what I have. Huh? The new rookies gave me all these funny little stickers.
Take them off, you moron.
Excuse me, sir, but the AI unit reported that a tank broke down and it'll take 4 hours to repair.
Why didn't you say so earlier?
So yes, the story is baffling compared to the original source material. It isn't a good anime adaptation at all because it makes so many changes, but it still is a good game and has a lot of positives. For instance, the entire English voice cast from the original movie returns in fully animated scenes.
Saito's company's standing by on the south side. Do you see anything?
Nothing of any interest.
Even though the storyline has a vastly different tone, they come back with the same expert performance heard in the feature film. I wasn't a big fan of the animation on Standalone Complex, and what has been done here is different from what's seen in the movie, but the style here is downright excellent. It seems like the intention was to draw from the manga, which is pointless to comment on because it was influential and legendary in its own way by now, but even if you don't like this game's direction and its weak storyline, it's worth playing just to see the amazing hand-drawn animated cutscenes. Ghost in the Shell's gameplay is relatively simple, with only 2 modes of fire and a persistent auto-lock feature that makes the game incredibly simple. This allows the player to focus on the game's unique movement system, which allows for traversal of any surface. Whatever geometry a stage throws at you, it's entirely possible to crawl across and over it. This was an unbelievable level of control for a PlayStation game released in 1997. Not only that, but if a player is to jump while on a roof or wall, their tank would be subject to gravity and fall back to its initial surface. As you can imagine, this allows for strategic movement in combat. If someone wants to get creative, they can, even if the game's action is so easy that it makes this just a little bit pointless. While the combat is straight as an arrow simple, the missions are where the game presents its challenges. Indeed, there are more than a few straightforward combat areas, but the game keeps things varied with interspersed objectives that have you disposing of explosives and chasing down enemies. Disposal missions are easy enough to explain, with the player rushing to avoid destruction within a time limit, but the chase missions really stand out. These levels are presented as on the rail, still managing to incorporate the movement mechanics into other vehicular situations. Depending on the stage, you'll be zipping around on boat platforms or down busy highways, taking down some of the game's most arcade-like bosses. You can replay these stages to take different routes that often have you against very different enemy placements. It isn't something that'll have you rushing to replay the entire game to see what's different, but the touch is very nice. There are also a load of boss battles, at least 1 per level, yet the majority of them simply require the player to strafe around their target. Some do surprisingly have some of the more complex functions of the original PlayStation tied to them, such as shifting textures and a lot of really interesting transparency effects. Later levels have bosses that go entirely invisible, being chased through rundown city districts, or act as rival tanks that have capabilities similar to your own. The former is definitely a callback to the film, and yeah, even though it doesn't really fit the rest of the game, it's nice to see one of the more iconic moments expressed here. What else is there for players of Ghost in the Shell? Well, aside from some of the best graphics on the system, an exceptional soundtrack. Sure, the rest of the game doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the movie aside from the characters and voices, but the music here pulls right from the darker cyberpunk tone of the film. It isn't too surprising that 2 separate versions were released as Megatech Body on both CD and vinyl. It might not be too surprising to hear about a game soundtrack being released on vinyl these days, as the format has sort of come back lately, but in 1997 it was well on its way out. It's a very nice release too from what I could pull up about it, something I'd more than like to be part of my own collection. It's always a pleasure to play these solid little gems on the PlayStation. While there are good examples on the system of games that do a lot with a little, there are a lot that aren't and don't. Thankfully, this game falls into the former. It isn't difficult or lengthy, but just about every moment is expertly tailored, and while it doesn't fit very well into the feature film's world, it could easily find a place in some of the extended material. Have you ever played Ghost in the Shell on PlayStation? What did you think of the game? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel and see it grow. As always, thank you for watching the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.